Welcome again. Governor of the Luhansk region in Ukraine, Serhiy Haidai, says Russia is now in control of around 70% of the key eastern city of Severodonetsk, and that Ukrainian troops are now making a tactical withdrawal to defensive positions further to the south. Analysts think that taking the city is a key aim for the Russian invasion, as it would mean that they control almost all of the Luhansk region, one of the two areas that make up the Donbass.
U.S. President Joe Biden says he would not suggest to Kyiv that it surrender territory likely in the east in order to bring about an end to the war. There have also been multiple allegations of torture inside the Ukrainian city of Kherson, which is currently under Russian occupation. Human Rights Watchers and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission inside Ukraine both say that they are investigating similar accounts and are looking at potential war crimes.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said to Parliament today the country will supply Ukraine with the Iris-T air defense system following pleas from Kyiv and German opposition parties to step up heavy weapons deliveries. Scholz says Germany had been delivering continuously since the beginning of the war, pointing to more than £15 million rounds of ammunition, 100,000 grenades and over 5,000 anti-tank mines sent to Ukraine since Russia invaded the country on February 24. Over the next few weeks, Germany and the Netherlands will also send 12 modern armored howitzer to Ukraine. Responding to critics in his speech to Parliament, Mr. Scholz said his government had responded to the Russian attack with a massive change of policy in Germany by opting to send heavy weapons into a war zone. Ukraine's request for heavy weapons intensified in recent weeks when Moscow turned its fiercest firepower on the country's east after failing to take the capital, Kyiv.
Meanwhile, Russia says the U.S. decision to supply advanced rocket systems and munitions to Ukraine would increase the risk of a direct confrontation between Moscow and NATO. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rubkov told Russian state news agency RIA Novosti that Moscow views the U.S. military aid package, which will include the M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, HIMARS, extremely negatively. The weapons long requested by Ukraine are intended to help it strike enemy forces more precisely from a longer distance. Until now, the U.S. had refused to supply the long-range artillery amid fears that it could be used against targets in Russia.
I think so. Are you going to send long-range rocket systems to Ukraine?
We're not going to send to Ukraine rocket systems that can strike into Russia.
Senator, I know you want Congress to act, but do you believe as president you have a particular responsibility now?
Oh, I know I have to, but there's a Constitution. I can't dictate this stuff. I can do the things I've done, and any executive action I can take, I'll continue to take. But I can't outlaw a weapon. I can't, change the background check. I can't do that. And my whole career I've been doing it.
You just make a noise.
I don't know, but I think there's a realization on the part of rational Republicans, and I consider McConnell a rational Republican, I mean Cornyn is as well. I think there's a recognition on their part that we can't continue like this. We can't do this. I've got to go in. I got the Gold Star there.
Mr. Biden said the lethal aid would strengthen Kyiv's negotiating position against Russia and make a diplomatic solution more likely. Ukraine's President Zelensky has said his country has no intention of attacking Russia.
On what President Biden meant when he said we're not sending Ukraine rocket systems that could strike into Russia, since even short-range missiles could fly over the border if they're fired nearby. And is the White House concerned that sending a rocket system...
Well, more on that now, as U.S. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said on Tuesday, sending rocket systems to Kyiv is still under consideration by the Biden administration, but Washington will not send long-range rockets for use beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. U.S. officials said President Biden and his national security aides are in the final stages of preparing a new weapons package for Ukraine, with an announcement expected soon. possibly today. We've heard it, haven't we? Ukrainian officials have been asking allies for longer-range systems, including the Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS, that can fire a barrage of rockets hundreds of miles away in the hopes of turning the tide in a 3-month-long war.
Offer some clarity on what President Biden meant when he said we're not sending Ukraine rocket systems that could strike into Russia, since even short-range missiles could fly over the border if they're fired nearby. And is the White House concerned that sending a rocket system could be considered escalatory?
So let me first say that those systems continue to be under consideration, so I don't have anything to preview on anything specific there. But as the president said, we won't be sending long-range rockets for use beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. But right now, I don't have anything to preview for you today.
Secondly, could you also
Joining us now is our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird. It's good to see you. Lots of smiles here in the studio between me and Amarachi. But Maria, if the president had said before he was not sending long-range rockets to Ukraine, why the announcement today?
Well, as you all mentioned earlier, there's a large part of Ukraine that has been occupied by Russia. And I think the real question is, how likely is it that Ukraine will be able to come to an end of this war sometime soon and being able to preserve its sovereignty? I think the U.S. is taking into account that their sovereignty is definitely at risk, and maybe even greater risk than it was just a few weeks ago or days ago, to be very honest. And so at this time, the U.S. is trying to find as many ways as possible to support Ukraine, as they have been a leader in supporting Ukraine. And I can, assure you that it has been many conversations within the White House, especially with those council security measures and those who are focused on international relations and affairs. We also have stated before that President Biden has a long history and a long-standing relationship overseas, and his support of international relations, and that was going to be one of his strong points within his administration. And so we're seeing now that, where he stood in the beginning in late February, he's now just putting forth kind of the necessary artillery and machinery and obviously military aid package that will allow for Ukraine to potentially have a greater chance of sovereignty.
And Russia says it considers the U.S. decision a direct threat. But does the U.S. have buffers in place in case Russia decides to act on its criticism of the United States decision?
I think there are obviously some measures in place to address that. I think the U.S. is very hopeful that it will not get to that point. We know that there has been tension between the U.S. and Russia even prior to this situation with Ukraine in the war with Ukraine and Russia. And so this is something that the U.S. has been very tactical and strategic around, not wanting to engage in a way that could put any type of war between Russia and the U.S. or even any sort of enhanced tension that could lead to the detriment of what I think is the focal point this time, which is assisting Ukraine in preserving its sovereignty.
Maria, does the United States understand how Ukraine intends to use these weapons? Although the Ukrainian president has said his country has no intentions of attacking Russia, but to Russia, sending long-range rockets and missiles, that's what it means. You're targeting the enemy. The enemy in this instance is Russia.
Yes, the U.S. obviously was very a little slow to state that they would be using these rockets or sending these rockets over. And so the question is what kind of conversations they've had with Ukraine, what is some of the information that has been released to them that will ensure, to your point, that this will not obviously impact any of the neighbors. This will not impact any, as you said, attack on Russia, because then that will be perceived as the U.S. attacking Russia. And I think that's really where the U.S. is trying to stay far away from, is as we've stated before, the president has been very clear that there will not be any military, U.S. sending over any boots on the ground, any military personnel on the ground. And so I think that if the U.S., if these rockets do make it over to Russia, that will signal something very different than what obviously President Biden is trying to signal, which is supporting Ukraine rather than a U.S. war and a U.S. attack on Russia.
Is there any reason why, these countries are acting unilaterally, the U.S. sending weapons to Ukraine, as we've seen in other conflict areas of the U.S. and NATO countries have been involved in? There's been a collective effort, to send weapons and boots on the ground, even though that's not the case in this instance. But why is there no collective responsibility to either send weapons to Ukraine or have a joint response to what Russia is doing in the country?
As we've been watching this whole time, I think the U.S. has been criticized, to be very honest, for some of that. And we know that there has been some collaboration between NATO and various EU allies. And that has been one of the points of consideration, I think one of the points of dialogue over these past few months. And so we've seen some collective measures obviously coming together to support Ukraine. We know that Germany is speaking out. We know that there are various other, but as you stated before, every country is kind of doing their own individual support of Ukraine. And so I think that as we look to see where the future of this war ends up and the future of the support for Ukraine, will they be able to come together? But again, you can see that every country is supporting Ukraine in a very different way. And as we know right now, the world has been very fragmented. And I think that the U.S. is trying to not only be a leader, but also a leader in bringing together allies and trying to have one collective voice. But the war is moving very fast. And I think that due to the economic impacts, there is a push globally to have an end as quickly as possible.
And Maria, President Biden says he does not intend to oust the Russian president, but at this point, there is no love lost between both leaders. What can you say about the current state of relations between the United States and Russia?
At this time, there's been very minimal conversation. It's just the focus really is on the fact that there's no support from the U.S. for Russia invading Ukraine, and that the support is that Ukraine is able to keep its sovereignty. And that's kind of where it stood. Obviously, there have been sanctions against Russia, trying to find ways. But I think right now it's looking at the lives, the casualties, the humanity concerns that exist. As we've mentioned earlier, as you all mentioned earlier, some of the torture that's happening with Ukrainian people. And obviously so many lives have been lost. So the humanitarian efforts there to support Ukraine, but also noting that this is not only having an economic impact on Russia and Ukraine, but this is having a global impact, and more specifically for President Biden's concerns is an impact on the U.S. economy as well.
And still on the rockets to Ukraine, President Biden has said that the lethal aid will strengthen Kyiv's negotiating position. I mean, for analysts, they would be really wondering why and if, a diplomatic solution would be likely. But can you tell us what perhaps Congress members there, the United States, what they really think about where the war is, this invasion in Ukraine, and the U.S. support, how much support they're giving to the Ukrainians?
Whether or not you sit on the Republican or Democratic side of the fence, I think that the support is for Ukraine. I don't think that there's a question around that. I think the question is what type of aid packages. I think that as we see the months, if we continue on this path for more weeks and months, there will be less support, especially from the Republican Party, because we are seeing such an impact on the U.S. and the global economy. But the real question, as you stated, is some of this, now we're moving into another direction with rockets being provided to Ukraine as a sense of military artillery and military aid packages. And so that, I think, is where we might begin to see some dissension there. You might even see some Democrats that don't support some of that, some of those types of support of Ukraine. And so the question is, are we going to begin to see different types of aid packages? And are we going to continue to be a leader in trying to support Ukraine, or will we begin to see the U.S. tailing back? But I think Congress as a whole is supportive. It's just about where we sit right now with the type of support that we're providing.
Maria Bird in Washington, thank you again for speaking with us, Maria, and keeping us updated. Well, the Kremlin says Russia does not trust Ukrainian promises not to fire U.S.-supplied rockets into Russia. Government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov accuses the United States of adding fuel to fire by supplying advanced rockets to Ukraine and saying it did not trust Kyiv not to fire them into Russia.
He was talking to reporters today where he says, "We believe the U.S. is deliberately pouring fuel on the fire. The U.S. is clearly holding the line that it will fight Russia to the last Ukrainian." Peskov also said that Russia did not rule out a meeting between President Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky, but stated that any such talks needed to be prepared in advance and with the goal of signing off on a finalized peace deal.
It is understood U.S. President Joe Biden has agreed, as we've been mentioning, to provide Ukraine with advanced rocket systems that can strike with precision at long-range Russian targets as part of a $700 million weapons package expected to be unveiled today.
Poland's Prime Minister has called for Russian assets to be seized to help fund Ukraine's reconstruction following Moscow's invasion. Speaking at the opening of a new Polish-funded shelter for displaced people in Borodyanka in the Kyiv region, Morawiecki said it was not enough to freeze Russian assets held in Western banks and called for them to be confiscated. He also praised the passage of a sixth round of EU sanctions in Russia, saying the measures were needed to cause an economic hit that would leave Russia unable to wage a cruel, barbaric war. Russia calls its operation in Ukraine a special military one. The EU agreed on Tuesday to ban the bulk of imports of Russian crude and oil products in its latest round of sanctions following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The housing in Borodyanka will be able to accommodate 352 people, women, children, and the elderly who lost their homes due to the invasion. The housing consists of 4 units with 14 modules each. It includes sanitary modules, laundry dining rooms, playrooms, administrative modules. It also has electricity, heat, and it is fully furnished. Borodyanka is the first town in the Kyiv region where such housing is introduced because it suffered catastrophic losses amidst fighting in the region early in the conflict. 552 private houses, 24 apartment buildings, 2 schools and all the administrative buildings and partially or fully destroyed, according to Ukrainian authorities. The next container houses are planned to be installed in Bucha, Makariv, Ivankiv, Hostomel, and also in the suburbs of Chernihiv.